Folk magic has a powerful pull. It can express complex metaphysical ideas that, for most of us practicing today, had once felt like the purview of the New Age. Magical ideas that once seemed fantastical, through the lens of folk magic, can suddenly feel earthy and vital. Techniques that once felt silly can begin to feel ancestral. The source texts go from channeled writings to myths and folktales and academic papers. There's an artistry and intelligence grouped in with modern-day practitioners of folk magic that give the disenchanted Western mind permission to think differently. Coupled with the aesthetic power and the engrossing scholarship inherent in the modern-day study of folk magic can sometimes be a cold distance and a whiff of a larp. Can the practices of people alive during the witch trials, people who might scry entrails or bleed their cattle on fairy hills to propitiate the good neighbors, ever truly be unlocked for a person in a contemporary world so removed from this archaic way of life? Even as someone with a podcast that focuses on folk magic, I often feel like there can be something missing in translation when I encounter many of these antiquated and esoteric beliefs and practices, especially when sifted through and untangled from primary sources. I am extremely lucky to have just returned from an intensive workshop with Corinne in Washington State. There are many great things I can say about studying under Corinne, but paramount for me is how alive she can make the folkloric practices and beliefs, which in less capable hands might feel like mere relics or curios. Rooted in her deep study of the folk beliefs surrounding plants, trees, the dead, and wider metaphysics, Corinne has that rare ability to re-enchant and unlock a worldview and way of life that otherwise may have vanished completely. Corinne's almost playful willingness to test drive and experiment with the folk ways of our ancestors felt like it summoned them to the room and made them feel at home and welcomed in our world. Corinne Boyer, welcome to Radical L Fam. It is an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Chad. Really fun to be here. Always interesting to see what comes out through these connections. So thank you for having me. Thanks for thinking of me.
Hell yeah. Yeah. So I'm only a week or so back from doing a really special intensive at your home up in Washington, which was incredible. And I told you when we were there that I've been wanting to have you on the show for a while. But since I knew that this time together was imminent for over a year, I'm like, well, I want to wait until we do this before I have you on, just because, I knew there'd be tons of questions I wouldn't have had beforehand, and also just getting that rapport. So yeah, it's very cool to have you here. I want to explore some of your books, but I also want to talk a bit about your process of teaching and what got you there. So maybe just to kind of kick that off, I'm curious, you'll often hear people who start to write books when they're asked what inspired them originally. They say, well, I wanted to write the book I wish I could have read. I'm curious if teaching might be something similar. Is there something you figured out at a certain point that you could impart to people that you wish could have been imparted to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I guess, yeah, I was reflecting a bit on teaching recently, actually, before our intensive, because I just came up on like 15 years of having my business as it is kind of now. But I started teaching when I was about 26. I taught my first class at the end of that year. And so I'd been studying plants for about 8 years. And I never had it in my mind like that I would teach. There was never an interest at all, or that I would write, actually. But I just thought I would do practitioner work. So I'd been studying community herbalism and um, ethnobotany and plant toxicology, and I was going to do actually naturopathic school and decided on community herbalism instead because it just felt like more of a calling. I didn't want to be stuck under fluorescent lights, owing $1 million for my college money, student loans. So but it was interesting. So I had started working at a herb shop 6 months previous to being teaching my first class, and that was where this, they did this newsletter basically 4 times a year, like a paper newsletter, and anybody that worked there could teach anything, which was kind of interesting. And I was like, oh, cool, whatever. But somebody was going to teach a class about tea blending, and they got sick, and they were basically like, hey, one of my coworkers said, hey, tomorrow, can you teach this class for me? It's like just tea blends at the local, kind of close to the library. There was this community center, and I thought, sure, so I was super nervous, and it was like 6 people, and it's like I it's like I remember it so well, and I brought all the herbs, and we talked about it, and I was like, that was fun. And so from there, I started kind of, for the first maybe 5 or 6 years, well, 5 years that I worked there, I just taught just really basic stuff, plant walk and how to make folk medicine tinctures, stuff like that. Nothing terribly interesting, honestly, but it was fun, and I was nervous all the time, and it just took me a long time to kind of get over that. But I knew that I really loved connecting with people and about plants, and so the more I did it, the more comfortable I got, and I would, talk at a conference here and there. And I guess what happened, like what you said, is that I eventually got to the place where I wanted to create what I couldn't find in the world, what I would have wanted when I was learning about plants, and that was after I finally found the genre of folklore and started reading about, the traditional history of plants, not just the kind of higher medicine history, more like the people's history of how they use plants for folk medicine. And of course, there's all this magical usage. So I got really into that, and I designed a program kind of around that, but also the seasons. And so 15 years ago was my first year teaching kind of from my home as like a business. I finally took some time to develop that program. And I guess from there, I had no idea, what would happen. I always tell my students that very first year, it was a once a week program for a year about just, traditional uses of local plants. And so we included, of course, ethnobotanical information, but also a lot of European information, and looked at parallels, but it was mostly medicine making, wildcrafting, and basic community or herbalism. And that's still what I teach today, one of my programs. But I always told people every week, I thought no one's going to show up, and I had like 6 people or 7 people, and they'd show up, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, oh my God, they're paying me to do this. I love this so much. And it took me a full year to kind of expect them. I swear it took a while. So from there, I guess, everything has been created and taken me down these pathways I never would have thought, based on what students have wanted, really. It's really been from people in my classes saying, hey, we want more. Let's do a year 2. And then so I was like, okay, well, I'm not a clinical herbalist. I was never interested in that. So let's go into folk magic more. So creating that program, and then people in that program saying, hey, we want another year of this. So I actually have a total of 8 years of curriculum. And I'm always fine tuning the teachings. I'm always trying to make it better. I feel like there's this kind of ratio that's the first year you teach a program, the next time you teach it, or the first course or whatever, the next time you teach it, you have to improve it by 25 or 30%, because there's kind of things that didn't really work right, and you're working out the kinks, and then, oh, I didn't like this, or I want to add this. And then after that, it's maybe like a 10% change every year, every time you teach it. There's always some tweaking or whatever. So yeah, it's become creating curriculum is a really fun challenge. It's really fun to be like, how can I bring these, kind of esoteric concepts about, especially working with spirits and folklore and folk magic, and to people, and like have them, learn in the most effective way. So it's been a really interesting challenge, I guess, too. But definitely created out of a need of not seeing it, not finding it. I think my programs are really unique, for sure, still.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm curious, was it a big jump for you at a certain point in that timeline where you started to realize that you could really go deep on the spiritual aspect of things with people and not just talk about it as sort of folkloric concepts, when you could be like, we're going to have a folk magic intensive where I'm going to be talking about engaging with spirits in a very mundane way? Was that a big jump?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like at first, part of it was, creating the herbalism program was really based on, really practical stuff, with plants. It's like learning the plants, learning how to make medicine, and all these things. And we'd get exposed throughout the year to all these esoteric concepts because they're in the handouts. And that's what led me to write books, was writing handouts. And I'm thinking, anyway, that kind of led to books. But why not use these handouts for a book? So over time, it's like, I think that what happened was I wanted to go deeper for sure. I mean, so it was kind of, I mean, students were asking in a way like, "What do you want to do next?" But then they wouldn't know what I would want to do. So I got to choose in a way. So the basic, using plants for just physical medicine, just is really limited for me. Like, there's so much more to it than that. I feel like people of the past were so much more creative with the ways they applied the plants. For example, using certain plants against nightmares, or using it to keep away, restless spirits of the dead. There's so many more interesting things. So I found myself, as I would read folklore, remembering these bits and pieces and all these patterns and wanting to really share that stuff with people. So I think that, as people wanted more classes, and it's almost like the more I followed my own interests, the better things got. So the more people were opened up to it, and the more people, I feel like it attracted. In the beginning, it was really a lot of students, and now it's not as many. I had a lot of college students because we're close to college. Like, at a certain point, I had like 50% college students coming from Evergreen, and then eventually that changed. And when the context started changing, and it wasn't just kind of, oh, let's learn about local plants and make salves. It got weird pretty fast. Because that's the direction I wanted it to go. And honestly, I sometimes, one thing I've learned about teaching is, don't ever do the thing you think you should do. Do the thing you want to do, because the energy I have for the thing I really want to do is what feeds everybody else's fire and ends up being contagious. People get excited about it because I'm excited about it. And I learned that a long time ago. Even selling plants at a herb store where I was, excited, people would be like, yeah, I'm excited too. So I think it's the same with teaching and content. It's never about the shoulds. The shoulds just need to go away. So yeah, I've kind of, but at the same time, it's led into just really weird places that I never would have thought. It's not like I had some long-term plan or anything. And it's not like I picked up somebody else's curriculum and was teaching, and I had to create all this stuff from my own weird desires. Even like the folk magic program, which was year two kind of, after the herb program, it had three different, uh, like, versions, where I finally had to settle on the latest version about 9 years ago. But it had a couple early versions that weren't that great, that kind of stumbled and kind of failed. And then it took me years to, like, put that program together. I'd been learning about plants for 18 years, 9 years ago. Now it's been almost, 28 years. And so it's came from this just, I don't know, like, trying to create something that people would be able to really apply and feel confident, and also feel drawn into and find their own way with, and not just, I don't know, I try to leave a lot of room for people's own experiences and for them to be themselves. And I don't know. Yeah, that's really important to me because I think it's part of learning.
Yeah, that was actually my next question slash comment. Was one of my biggest takeaways from actually getting to do this intensive with you was the way you can bring up these very archaic, folklorically inspired concepts and techniques in a way that feels very alive. I feel like sometimes if I'm just reading out of a book, very old folk magic techniques, sometimes they feel like something I couldn't just try out. But sitting with you, you're explaining it in a very informed and enlightening way. But then you just go like, we're going to take this yew branch and we're going to put it in front of a candle flame and we're just going to scry it and see what happens. And you realize everybody in the room is able to actually get something out of that. And it's a very almost experimental approach to what seems like very old material. It's very freeing. Is that something that you're conscientiously trying to impart to your students?
Yeah, I think definitely, like, the courage to actually pick some of this lore and these old ways up and dust it off and breathe life into it again is so important. And one thing I like to say is 50-50. 50% intuitive, kind of just getting guided and doing whatever. And then, because you have to have some room for creativity, and then 50% historical. I think that's the formula that really works for me. If I was doing everything historical, there's a certain weird emptiness about it. If you pick up something from 250 years ago and you do it word for word and you have all the things, it's a little weird because it's out of a cultural context. However, at the same time, if we don't do that, we never get a reference point for what that's even like. So I think doing the historical stuff is super important. And I think the more you do it, the more you do different things and try different things, number one, you realize there's so much missing information, right? And that's where I come in. I'm trying to fill in the gaps where, is like what you said, you're reading something on the page and you're kind of like, this is weird. I kind of want to do it, but I don't really know how to do this, or they left this detail out, or what do I do for this? There's so many questions, right? So I feel like I can answer the questions, and kind of inspire people and fill in the gaps, because you see that after reading enough of this stuff, you see some of the same stuff over and over, but more or less filled out. So that means, sometimes folklore will just deem it, the folklorist writing about it or collecting it will just, it's only important enough to include 2 sentences, whereas another one about the same procedure includes like 2 paragraphs, and you're like, oh, all this missing information, that's what should have been in this other piece of lore. So it's almost like I feel like it's my job to provide that cushioning and context a little bit, and then I feel like that makes people realize, this isn't, these ways aren't that far from us. They're just under the surface. It's not that weird, actually. It feels people really get so much from just really basic stuff like making charms and putting them in their car and ensorceling objects and doing scrying and doing old weird folk divinations. The feedback I get, and I mean, I already know for myself, that's why I do it, because I know it's effective for me, but hearing from others and seeing others be like, "Oh, yeah, this was awesome." I remember this one time, I have a group of students that's been with me for kind of a long time, and they've taken repeated programs, some of them like 7 or 8 years, because they'll just keep going. They're like, "We just want this in our life." And so, eventually I give them a good discount or whatever, right? But but I remember we were doing this year 4 of the folk magic program, which was basically like they were like, "We want another year," and I was like, "I don't know what I'm going to do, you guys." They're like, "We don't care, just do whatever," and I was like, "Fine." So it ends up being this. It's a very strange year of grimoire magic and the snake's apothecary and necromancy and teacups and all this stuff. So seances is just really weird, but it was really fun. And one time I brought out a bunch of beef hearts for them to scry. And I walked around and, we had white enamel, like these rusty, shitty, like old turn of the century plates. And I had a big cauldron and I had all these beef hearts with a bunch of water. And I just laughed as I ladled all these beef hearts onto the plate, half, they're cut in half. But people were like, it was just hilarious. But you know what? People got so much out of it. We laughed so hard because it was so funny. But everybody was like, whoa, scrying with a beef heart is so much easier than water scrying. And I was like, I know. So it's not being afraid to try some of this kind of gnarly shit. I love that stuff. I love all of it because you realize it's not that hard. You go to the butcher, you get a beef heart, you de-thaw, and then you use it. And or liver works good too because there's a lot of depth of field, so you can actually see a lot, especially out in the open daylight. So if you do it do like a noontime scrying versus a midnight scrying, but yeah, I think just being not afraid to try some of the stuff, and then you realize it's in our blood. So I think that's part of it too. And people just need a little hand holding.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Yeah, I think scrying in particular, I think it could come off like something you need to really practice at for a long time to get a grasp of. And my experience jumping into some techniques with you that aren't techniques I've been familiar with before that it's just natural. You're just looking to see impressions, and that's that simple. It's not something you
Totally.
need to be gifted or blessed by a
No.
spirit to be able to do.
Right. A lot of these things are like just doing it, you feel like, well, it's not that hard, but it just takes time and, the processing of it. And sometimes you got to adjust some things. Some of it's harder than others. A lot of people find water scrying a lot harder than fire scrying, for example, because of the light. You got to mess with the lights with water scrying a lot to get it right. But once you get it, you get it, like what we were doing with the candle and realizing that it's just taking the time for some of these simple things, and you can get a lot from them, and that's what's constantly surprising about folk magic to me. I love it. I mean, I never take that for granted because it's like it's amazing. And I just hearing people's stories is what's always keeping me inspired as well. People's experiences. It's like there's a really simple thing we say in the classes sometimes, which is magic works. It sounds really dumb, but it happened after some people were asking me about getting rid of a really shitty neighbor, and I gave them some ways, and a week later this person moved out, and they were like, "What?" They had been trying to get this person to move out for months, and they did this thing, and then we were like, "Magic works," and it's true though. It's simple, but if you do it and you believe in it, the power of belief is everything. So
Hmm.
so we gotta try these things to believe them and to understand also, like, the somatic experience of doing of some of this stuff is so important, like, to actually feel it in our bodies and feel like we have, it's not just dry on paper because we do have some agency where we do have, like, all of a sudden we have to use our intuition at different points, and that's really I think, the most rewarding part about it.
Yeah, that's very well said. Another thing I really appreciated about your approach was the emphasis on trance but also the way you demonstrate trance or encourage us to do it. For one, I think just having trance be a key part of getting into any particular subject is really valuable and can bring in all that internal information. But also, most of the other classes I've done, or even 101 type books I've read, trance is either from that very narrative journey perspective, where there's a long build up where, a teacher's taking you to a place and then kind of like letting go of your hand and you see what happens. Or at the very least, it's a very specific process of like body sensation awareness and, send your attention out and like all these different things, which honestly, sometimes I find really helpful. But I thought it was fascinating the way with you, it was just like lights are down and you guys have 15 minutes go. And it's that thing where you go, oh, I don't need a bunch of techniques to do it. It starts to happen, or you figure out what is going to work for you naturally. So yeah, I would love to hear your philosophy of why you do it that way instead of maybe a more detailed explanatory process.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I guess, the way I was taught was very specific in, a certain way, and of course, it was helpful and amazing, and, I'm extremely grateful, when I started learning trance work and the context I did, but I kept doing it, after my training, which was a 2.5-year training, and I started changing things for myself, like, I really preferred the bone tapping as a sound versus a drum, and that's just me, and I tried rattle, and I tried some other things, and I've tried bells, I like that too, but I really prefer the bone tapping 'cause it's so jarring, but then I guess I realized that for myself, one of the things that I came to was, okay, this whole thing about, like, training people to do trance, training myself, I had to be trained, right, to do it. I could it didn't come to me, just, naturally staring at the fire spinning wool, so I had to be trained, and I started asking myself after, doing it for 5 years just for myself. Of course, I wasn't teaching it till after I'd been doing it for maybe, I don't know, a while, but I started thinking, like, this isn't very natural. Like, what's the whole thing with like the human condition and trance work, And I didn't, so I took it out of its like little weird, container that I got it in basically. And I started unraveling it and being like, what is this really about? And why do we need training for it in this society? And I just started asking those questions because it kind of bothered me that I needed a specific set of parameters to do it. I kind of felt like, why can't I just do it? I need to like be laying down with an eye pillow and have a certain sound and have a certain smell and have all these associations and it, even though it worked, but I wanted to remove as much of that as possible and see if it still worked. It was almost an experiment because I felt like there was too much around it that didn't need to be there, number one, and I found that to be definitely true. So I cut away the meat and got to the bone, basically got to the heart of it. I tried to cut away all of the unnecessary things that didn't feel like they needed to be there because I have a belief that, we just as humans can enter trance-like states without substance, without drugs, without a lot of we need some way in, and I think rhythm, is a good one. It's a safe one. For a lot of people, it's really good that it's sober. It's really good that it's also just, it's pretty comfortable compared to fasting or going without water or going without sleep, some of the traditional ways, but that we have an ability to enter trance-like states, a mild trance-like state with just a couple conditions, right? Instead of like tons of, also, yeah, like without, yeah, tons of parameters around it, but also like without a lot of fear. That's one thing I removed. I feel like if we, give a lot of pretense about this can be scary or dangerous, it affects what happens. So I removed that because what I've seen over the years in my own experience of doing trance for 8 years before I started teaching about it, um, like weekly or whatever, doing it a lot, was that, very rarely did something bad happen. And those few times that I had some pretty scary shit happen, I mean, there's always gnarly shit, but in terms of like actual dangerous stuff, there's a few times I had those times, I took care of it. But I just felt like it felt unnecessary to be like, This is super dangerous. You need to look out for evil spirits all the time." I mean, I'm sure people with traditional knowledge on certain things might say that's irresponsible of me, but I also feel like going into a mild trance like state, especially under kind of pretty low stakes conditions, is something that all of us can access. And I want it to feel accessible and not just feel like, oh, you have to be working with the shaman to do it, or you need to take entheogens to do it. And I guess that was what I was up against. You know, I had to challenge my own kind of what was taught to me, but also how I assimilated it. Right? We all take these things and kind of regurgitate them and make them our own in a way. So that's kind of what I ended up doing, and I found that it worked. You know, so I've had over 400 students in these last 15 years, and you know, I've done trance with almost, I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them, because 2/3 of my or 3/4 of my programs involve trance or ritual work, and there's only a small chunk that is kind of not doing that stuff. But and people, you know, yeah, I've seen that it works without all of the, I don't know, other considerations, if that makes sense. It's about accessibility. It's also about the power of belief that we don't need a lot of conditions to be in a trance-like state, and I think it's really true. So, it's been helpful for me. But, you know, I know not everybody agrees, and that's totally fine. But, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, whatever works. So, yeah, I feel like that's part of it too, is like, we need a tool, we need a way in, and that's why I always say trance work, night dreaming, and sensing, which is like
Mhm.
basically open-eyed visioning, and you know, those are the three ways that I connect with the spirits and spirit world beyond just random encounters, and of course omens, signs, and auguries as well. So those are kind of what informs my practices that I keep. You know, I always tell students, you got to practice all the time, do trance work, work with your night dreams, do the sensing, you know, keep track of omens and signs, and those are all the things beyond, you know, that's like the core of it. So because that's what's helped me, you know, stay connected. So I think that, yeah, removing a lot of the pretense around some of the trance work. That's why I like the term trance work. I don't like some of the other words. It's really open ended,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
So hopefully that's
I love
helpful.
that. No, totally. That's great. And just specifically the bone tapping technique that you do, which I found really just like evocative and exciting in a way that I really enjoyed. Is that a folkloric and older technique? Did you kind of develop that? I actually have not encountered that elsewhere of the bone tapping.
No, and it's not an older technique at all. I
Okay.
was just told that when I learned, it's like most people use the drum or a rattle,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
I just thought it would anything that makes noise, so I think I just kind of thought it would work, and it did. But I'm sure other people do it in some context. I haven't heard of it, so because it seems just like a natural thing to do. If you didn't have a drum, you got some bones laying
Hmm.
around, and they got to be hard bones, otherwise they'll break. So, but yeah, it felt like the natural thing to do. I wanted something a bit more. It feels like it's really, at least for me, it is jarring, and some people have a real hard time with it at first, but then they find that that's the only way they can do trance after they learn how to do it that way. So it's everybody has different tastes, but it's hard on the ears, and it just makes you be really present. It's uncomfortable a little bit because it's so loud, but
Hmm.
it does a lot of weird things with sound. But I think it then you get used to it, and it's like whatever. So it totally works.
I've heard you in a different context. Can't remember if it was a book or an interview. You were talking about how a lot of the seership herbs have a bitter component that kind of
Mm.
brings you to attention. And to me, there's like a similar thing with that jarring sound. It really keeps you focused in a weird way, which I like.
Absolutely, it's not relaxing. You know, that's why we
Mhm.
sit up, we don't lay down. If you lay down, you're more apt to fall
Mhm.
asleep, you know? So we sit up and we're just I mean, we have no lights and a candle, but, and some people put a scarf over their heads just to keep out the visual distraction of even a single candle, but it's exactly that, like a calling to attention, like, "Oh, we're doing something," you know, we're paying attention, we're not just kinda, like, gonna take a nap, which is so
Yeah.
easy to do.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I've got 2 children. I could take a nap any time of day
Right.
for sure, so I
Yes.
appreciate it. Good
Yeah.
technique. Um, you said a handful of times during our class how you worked with Johannes Gardback, and did trolldom and were his first remote student, which is really cool. I'd say a through line of this podcast for a lot of our guests is at least some interest or experience with trolldom. And I'm interested now that you are teaching yourself, and I know that you even do some classes specifically on trolldom. I'm curious how living in the Pacific Northwest maybe is co-creating a different type of trolldom than what Johannes developed in Sweden. Are you seeing it evolve with you in a different way?
Well, I started working with Johannes 9 years ago, and we worked together for about 2 years. Right, and that was in the beginning when he was just experimenting, seeing, "Is this gonna work? I don't know." I approached him and I said, "Hey, would you do this?" And he was like, "Sure, why not?" And so, thankfully, it worked, and, I had to get up at 3:30 in the morning and, every week, and we would meet. We took a couple breaks during that time, but, mostly we're pretty on it. Now, I had already learned trance work and a lot of stuff and knew a lot about plants, but I really wanted that Scandinavian um, kind of aspect to it. I was really drawn to Scandinavian stuff since I started researching folklore because I really loved that there was a lot of work with the dead that really resonated with me, and also just how rustic it was, and just something drew me there. And so when I learned, I had been studying it on my own for quite a while, and then I learned from Johannes, and yeah, he definitely trained me to do readings. He trained me to do sensing, and he gave me materia magica and different things like that. We got real specific because he said, "Well, what do you want to learn?" Because he didn't have a curriculum at that time exactly. He of course was teaching people in Sweden, but he didn't have like a lot. It wasn't all developed yet. So yeah, so I guess that opened my eyes to just even more information that was just yeah, it really drew me in. And then after our time together was, done, he came here and we had a meeting, and I curated an exhibit for him, and he did a talk and lectures and whatnot, and it was really awesome. And I was initiated here on American soil, so that felt really, really special. I'm into the Choldom tradition, so I was like, whoa. And I don't talk about that much because I don't want to flaunt it around like a badge and say, oh, I'm initiated. I just don't do it. It's really personal, and it was really powerful and special for me. But after that, I ended up meeting my husband, my now husband, Pieter, who came into my life and who's Swedish. And um, we got together, I guess, 7 years ago, right after Johannes and I said, okay, I guess our training's done. And so I've been really blessed. I go to Sweden twice a year, and Pietro has translated a ton of rare materials for me because he's really into folklore and folk magic and has been since he was a teen. Actually, I mean, since he's an artist, he's really been into it for a long time, and so that's added these other layers that I would never have without him and without being in the culture. I so in a way, like I don't feel like Trolldom has evolved. No, I don't feel like I'm changing it in any way. I do a year-long Trolldom program. We're almost at the end of it now. I don't advertise for it. It's in person, and it's not on the website. I do it because it's just one of my favorite things, and so I keep it pretty damn traditional. Yeah, we don't
Nice.
really actually do a lot of trance work in that program, not very much. I because we're learning about techniques, specific techniques. So we're doing stuff like, oh, okay, let's scry and vodka for spirit attachments on each other. Let's do lead pouring over the bread with the hole by the fire, and let's make snake ash. Let's do things like that. So we do stuff, but we don't do a lot of trance work. And I think sometimes students miss it, but it's really, that's not part of the tradition in the same way. I mean, trance work is like implied, and Johannes always said that. It's like to be able to communicate with spirits and do trance work, it's implied. It's not said, here's how you do it. So it's like implied you already knew how to do that. And it makes sense. So I'm always thinking about looking at the interaction between humans and spirits and kind of seeing where I can find the ways people were connecting. So, and bringing that to the table. So I think that's super important because once again, we're in a modern culture. We need to be trained because we don't have a culture that supports that kind of thing at all. So learning the Swedish folk magic and the Scandinavian folk magic and going there and seeing these places and going to these places on the land has changed me and in ways. But yeah, I don't feel like it's really an evolution, if that makes sense. I
Yeah.
try to stick with it in a traditional way to honor that tradition and
Right.
just yeah, it's in my blood, but it's not my home, but I am able to have because my husband's there, be in the culture, which is so different than just going to visit. Being with somebody in the culture is really different. So that's been such a huge gift.
Yeah, that's great. I'd be remiss not to talk about some of your books while you're here. That's definitely how I first found you. My entrance to really going deep into magic personally was through that traditional witchcraft lens. and my gateway drug was Jim McGarry's book of that name. And so after reading that and being really lit up by what she was writing about, I took the approach I did with music in high school, where I'd find these indie labels and just listen to all the bands on them as a way to find more artists. And so when I saw that there was you in the Troy Books lineup, and you were from the Pacific Northwest and bringing this different lens to things, I really dove into everything there. And I know that's not your exclusive publisher, but I'm just curious how you got looped in with Troy Books back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah, so similar to what you're saying too. I had no idea that the world of traditional witchcraft actually existed for a long time, unfortunately, and part of it was because I don't read blogs, or I didn't read blogs, and I wasn't on the internet much. I was just reading the work of dead people all the time and writing about folklore and doing my thing, and it wasn't until I moved out here, I guess, 14 years ago, and I'd already been teaching for like a year then, and it was around that time when I found Gemma as well, and actually Johannes. In one book, which was Serpent Songs, there's the anthology by Scarlet Imprint, and I somebody had written something about it online that I stumbled upon, and I felt like I thought I should get this, so I got that book. That was my first. That was like my first occult, modern occult book or whatever. And I read that, and Johannes's essay and Gemma's essay just totally stood out to me, like just hit me hard. I read. There's other really good ones in there too, but I really was struck by both of them. So Johannes, that's how I reached out to him. I was like, "Oh my God, if this person would ever, train me, it'd be incredible." Which I was blessed. He said yes. But then with Gemma, I ordered. So I found out she had more books, and I also got Johannes's book that he had just published at the time. And with Gemma, I mean, I just love her work so much. Oh my God, I love her writing. I love the feeling of her books, her aesthetic, and I fell in love, of course, and was like, "Holy shit, this is amazing!" I had no idea that it existed. Um, and around that same time, I also found Three Hens Press and started getting into their stuff, and so it was like a whole world opened up to me. I was like, "Oh, people are into this." But I had, I had written handouts, like I said, for programs, and then I did do a free herbal newsletter for 5 years. So I distributed 4 times a year, like 500 copies of a herbal newsletter that my former husband had helped me do. Basically, he did all the graphics and helped me with that, and we got local advertisers to pay like whatever $25 for a little business card ad, and 8 of them would pay for a printing of 500. So I did that for 5 years to kind of see what it was like to just put some writing in the world, and I really liked that because I didn't have an editor and I didn't have to work with anybody, and I just got to do it, and I just got to say whatever the hell I wanted. So those are really special. I still have some paper copies of those. There were 21 total. The first one, a friend wanted to join me and ended up leaving after an issue, so I knew that would. We were just kind of trying it out, and I figured that would happen because they're busy. She's a very busy person, but it was fun to set sail with her, of course. But it was that gave me a sense of, okay, this I really love writing. That was really, and I love sharing it with people. So that needed to happen. And then I had these kind of more polished essays and plant profiles and different things from that. And I thought, well, these are good enough for a book. The other handouts weren't. So I just took a shot in the dark, and I wrote Troy Books. I guess it'll be, like 10 years ago this fall. And I just said, hey, I gave them a sample chapter of Elder and Apple because I thought, well, let's start with the trees. And I just said, hey, would you guys ever be interested in this? Blah, blah, blah. Here's my idea. And they were like, yes. And I just couldn't believe it. I was so stoked. So I started working with them then and was just like so excited. And I wanted to do a trilogy because I had enough material for at least the first two. At first, it was just going to be two: the wayside plants, Under the Bramble Arch and Under the Witching Tree. But I realized I really wanted to include the witches' plants, the garden plants too, the classic witches' herbs. So it started everything, the ball rolling, and thankfully I had help with photography from my former husband. Him and I still work together great, so we were able to do that. And yeah, it was really fun, and just then I was hooked, Then I was like, "Oh, I love this. This is so amazing because you make like a kind of a legacy that even after I'm gone, people can have these books and at least be inspired and learn something." And I wanted to also create the books that I haven't read, and couldn't find. So that's always the point now. So yeah, that's how it started. So I'm glad that they liked my stuff.
That's awesome. I did as well once I found it, so thank you. Yeah, 2 of your more recent books that I thought would be fun to chat about both have devil in the title. So to kick things off, I'm just curious, for one, how your thinking about the devil has evolved over time, and if you have gnosis about how you view the devil that's diverges from folklore at all. I know in the past you've described this force as the wild adversary. So yeah, I'm just curious where your head's at, since these are some books from the last year, specifically Between the Witch and the Devil, and the most recent one that I'm actually only halfway through, The Devil's Ointment.
Oh, do you like it so far?
I do. I love it.
Isn't
Yeah.
that crazy?
Yeah. It's very cool. We'll get
Good.
into that. We'll get
Okay,
into
cool,
that. Don't
cool.
worry.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so, mm, when Plants of the Devil, so that was the first devil book, that was
Yeah.
actually my second book, and so right around the same time that Under the Witching Tree came out, I started working, with Three Hands Press, because they were doing a journal at the time, and I submitted some work, and they liked it, and so then I, um was lucky enough to meet the publisher at a couple conferences, and basically he invited me to write for, because he liked my work, Daniel Schulk, and so he invited me to write for Three Hands Press and said, "Hey, would you ever want to do something?" And I said, "Well, I have had this idea about Plants of the Devil," and he said, "That sounds awesome. Let's go." So this was, I kind of sat down under the bramble arch and did Plants of the Devil, and that was a really hard book to write. I was so, like, so nervous because I was like, "Oh my god, this is, like, a hugely important topic. I can't fuck this up." And and it's really special, and I felt really it was kind of really pushing myself. Whereas the plant books were so kind of really easy in a way. I already had a lot of the material. It was just putting it together, organizing, having fun. This was painstaking, right? So it was such a different process to write Plants of the Devil because I had to create it from the ground up and I had to build on each chapter. Now, that's exactly how The Devil's Ointment was. Both of those two books were the hardest books, and Between the Witch and the Devil, those three devil books were the hardest books to write because they weren't just like individual chapters that could be put in where you could, and they're meant to be read from beginning to end. So you're not just skipping around, ideally, because you're building on these ideas as you go. So I guess that my view on the devil, the folk devil, the wild adversary, which that was one of the terms that I used in Plants of the Devil. I started working on that 9 years ago. So it's definitely changed with the more folklore I've encountered. In terms of gnosis about that, yeah, my approach to the devil is that it's an aggregate spirit, right? So the devil, it's like
Mhm.
this huge umbrella. It means, it has these kind of stereotypical attributes that we still have in modern society, which is really telling. I mean, thanks to religion, I suppose, but we still have, the devil with horns and a pitchfork and a red eyes and a black cloak or whatever it is, right? We still have these things and these association also thanks to Hollywood and Christianity. So it's one of these menacing figures that and really in some, it's amazing to me that in a lot of our country in America, people are still really scared of the devil. I mean, a huge majority actually, because we have a lot of religious extremists in this country, so it's a very taboo topic that I've taken on with some of these books and been like, yeah, hopefully nobody ever finds my address, and some of these scary, I mean, it could happen. I mean, we're in this crazy place, but anyway, um I guess that the way that I think about it is with aggregate spirits, what you need to do if you're working with them is you need to learn their attributes. You need to learn, it's not one spirit you're working with, it's many. So there, but it's a type of spirit, right? So it's a type of power. So with the devil, there's really particular attributes. And if you work with a certain type of folk devil, when we look at folk magic and medicine, people worked with the devil for healing, for different curing, for cursing, for all sorts of reasons, for money. I mean, we know that. But you see that people that certainly didn't consider themselves devil worshippers nor Satanists, they worked with the devil for power. I always say it's anybody who'd show up, Jesus, the devil, Mother Mary, demons, angels, whoever shows up and it helps. That's great. That's kind of how it was and is in many parts of the world today, I think. But I do come across quite a bit, not the majority, but a significant, surprising amount of folk magic that calls in the devil for aid, particularly in Swedish, Scandinavian stuff, but also British Isles. So I think that when we consider that there were certain attributes that would that the devil has these certain attributes. For example, supernatural spirit, not a spirit of the dead, right? Male presenting anyway. Animal like features, right? There's always some sort of cloven hooves, some sort of tail, some sort of weird thing. Remember, supernatural spirits often have 2 to 3 forms, right? So you get to learn the forms as you work with them. And then there's the attributes very dangerous, but also very cunning, very intriguing. There's an intrigue to it. It's not purely evil, this type of aggregate spirit. There's definitely something sensual. It doesn't have to be sexual, but it can be sensual and intriguing. And the thing I always tell my students when we talk about the devil of old or the forest devil, the folk devil, the wild adversary is the devil knows exactly what you want. And he knows, he, they know how, exactly what you want and what I want are going to be different. So what somebody else wants, somebody maybe needs a best friend, another person needs, like a mother, another person needs a lover, these things, the devil knows our vulnerabilities, the weaknesses, this type of spirit. It's many spirits that are like this, I think, not just one. So they know our weaknesses and they're able to approach us in a way that feels very personal, I think. And so the other part of it is there's always a bargain, right? The folklore of old tells us this. There's a bargain. I will give you this if you give me this. There's always a bargain. So when you see these attributes show up with a particular, with a supernatural spirit over a period of time, you start to be like, this is a devil type spirit. It's not the devil. There's not one, there's many. And then you can decide if you're going to work with it. And it is a slippery slope and it's dangerous. And you get to decide for how long and in what way because you have that agency. So I think that the devil is part of when we consider the spirit world in general and all the different types of spirits that we have that are in the invisible realm. The devil is one manifestation, and I just I wrote about the devil as a creature of the forest in Between the Witch and the Devil, because there's all these old roots where it just really resonates. And I mean, even in Plants of the Devil, there's parts of that where a nature spirit, male presenting and very, I mean, it can be a she devil also, or whatever, a they devil, but also very, very powerful. So I think that it's something that's in nature. I do. It just is. Are we open enough to receive it? Are we open enough to work with it? Maybe the answer is hell no, and that's fine. We don't have, nobody has to, but it shows up. If you do this work long enough, it will show up. That is my experience. How it shows up in the form it shows up, but there will be those particular attributes to let you know this is what that is. And, then you get to decide. There are benefits and there are dangers, if that's helpful.
Yeah, very well said. Um, so your book that came out last year, I believe, Between the Witch and the Devil, I am curious if you could just, for the listeners who haven't read it yet, kind of give a bit of what you're trying to explore in it, the basic pitch of what you were writing about.
Yeah. So Between the Witch and the Devil, was a special project because it's a self-published book. So I basically was like, I wanted to try my hand at self-publishing just to do it. There's pretty long waits with these small occult publishers that I work with, and they're incredible books. And it's worth the wait for sure. But I felt kind of a desire to bring this out in the world. So really at the heart of that book is the witch's sabbat, and that's what really that's what I wrote in the beginning. It's like the kernel of, in the middle, the gold in the middle of being surrounded by all this other stuff, but it's all related. So I felt like writing that book, I really wanted all that lore in one place. And I was really tired of having to, look in here for this fairy lore and look over here for this devil animal lore and to remember what this I had been collecting that lore off and on and doing different things with it in my classes. Like I taught a class about the fairy feast and the feast of the dead, and so I had a little bit over there. And then, thinking about the devil's animals, I had a little bit over here, and witches and the spirits and the color red, which, that's kind of been interesting. I had this over here. So basically I felt like I just wanted to create a work that brought it together in one place so people could go through. And it's a really weird book in a way, and it was also a hard one to write because it's like a building something, like I said, where I'm working on, it's like kind of taking people on this dark old road down to this, just there's a lot of macabre shit in there and just creepy stuff, but also it's some of my absolute favorite folklore. I mean, I don't know. I really feel like the folklore you know, sets the tone. It's what draws you in. It's, the way I put it together, it's my arrangement, so I kind of am very focused in a certain way. I'm excluding things and including things. So it's really about the witch's sabbat at the end of the day and the things that surround it. We have the night flight, we have the devil, yeah, as a forest animal, we have the pact, we have the witch's familiar, we have the witch's poison, maleficium. The relationship between the witch and the devil is really all about spirits. It's not just the devil. It's not just about the witch. It's all about spirits. And that's what I wanted to bring into it is some of this lore, and a lot of it came out of the witch trials and was, repeated over and over and changed and then brought into traditional witchcraft, for example, and Wicca, some of it. So it's extremely influential, some of this folklore. And so, on the way that we view witches and the devil today. And I just felt like, uh, yeah, and how it's really related to fairy lore and spirit lore. It's just fascinating to me. So I guess that was the drive, was putting it together, and the witch's sabbath being in the middle for a reason, because it's this, kind of diabolical backwards place in the dreamscape where anything's possible, a congress of spirits of the dead and supernatural spirits and practitioners, and like these really, old ancient powers, and I guess it's something that's always fascinating to me and always has been, the witch's sabbath, like in all the symbology, the mythology, the roots of it. Yeah, the strangeness, the creepiness of it, everything about it is just, it's really interesting. So, I guess that's why I put that together, and it was really fun to put it out there.
Yeah, I love the book. It's great.
Good.
Anytime we're kind of looking at, lore about witches' sabbats, witches in league with the devil, often, like you mentioned, we're looking at witch trial confessions to pull this information. It's come up a lot on the show. These confessions are controversial. Are they coming from duress? Are they coming from experience? Are they just transmissions of general folklore? I would love to hear your personal approach to working with that material and even incorporating it into a personal practice in the modern day. How do you deal with the complications?
It's a great question. It's very complicated. Now, it's something I really emphasize in my book because I think a lot of people don't emphasize it, is that a lot of this information came from, yeah, tortured, forced confessions. And so it is not a straightforward answer at all. It's a twisted lens on folklore because it was absolutely under duress and stress. It was absolutely like put in the wrong order in the wrong way. Like it's very mixed up. So I think that it represents, there's some value in that it represents what people knew of folklore of the time. So it brings up stuff, but then there's a bunch of made up shit that people just threw together because they had no choice and they were trying to appease the powers that were just so evil upon them. So I think that it's really I think it's dangerous to work with at face value unless we find some other older streams. And that's what can be kind of hard because it's like, if you look at the bulk of the witch trials, 1450 to 1750 is the time we're looking at, and finding older stuff, is challenging. The farther we go back, the more convoluted everything gets, and the harder it is to even, if you read a book that has a translation from 1,000 years ago, there's so much fucked up stuff that isn't. It's you can tell you're like this isn't just straightforward. Reading stuff from 2,000 years ago, it's like yeah, you maybe get 70% of it, and you can tell 30% of it's just wrong. It's not. It can't. It doesn't translate correctly just because it can't. No one can do it. So it's kind of interesting. The thing that I like to look at is fairy lore and fairy tales. That is really the roots that I think informed a lot of the confession material, what people understood about that. So I've been studying that stuff for a long time. I mean, related to plants and otherwise, just reading fairy tales because I have kids. My son's 22 and my daughter's almost 11. So I that's one great thing about it, about having kids, is you get to read weird old creepy fairy tales and it's really fun and you remember how much you loved them as a kid. But I think that that has been helpful because that stuff can be parallel to some of the confessions, and you realize there's these parallels and you see like, okay, here's an oral tradition that was starting to be recorded around 1250. That's what Catherine Briggs says, where we started to keep track of things like the fairy feast and these encounters. And then we have the roots of the witch's sabbath starting around the same time, before the trial period really came up. There's like, these some records of this, that these groups, um, these transgressive groups that were being punished for witchcraft crimes that started off everything, going in that direction, really, and all the weird, the climate that had to be present for everything to happen exactly how it did. It's really crazy, actually, how those trials happened for that long and how many people died. It's actually unbelievable, but it makes sense with the terrible times that people were living in, all the pressures. So I think that looking at, yeah, fairy lore and spirit lore alongside of that stuff can help bring things together. That and also just folk magic practices. So sometimes I wonder though, you read something from the witch trials and then you see it. For example, Isabel Gaudi's confession, of course, which is arguably the most famous witchcraft confession of all time because it was four different confessions and they were so detailed and so incredible and had so much information about the between the witch and the devil. And I told you I went to the churchyard in Aldern in Scotland and got to stand there in the old church where she said that she met the devil out in the graveyard there, and it was so powerful just to be there and be like, holy shit. Wow, it was just, I'll never forget that experience. But thinking about, you know, what she wrote and then seeing it over a period of time in the next 300 years and 400 years be in different books of folklore, showing up in different ways, what she had, confessed and not wrote, but confessed, and how it had been kind of integrated into folklore too. So it's really interesting. Sometimes it can be hard to tell basically the roots of where, what came first. Sometimes when we read folklore, it can be like, oh, this is a folklore collection, but it's who gathered it, what year was it gathered, what sources were they going for? Were they looking at literary sources or getting oral tradition? And so I think that's it's a lot of unraveling. And I'm not a, professional folklorist in the sense of I didn't go to a university, but I think that can be really tricky. I always like to think about tracing the lore backwards and finding like a piece of lore and going backwards and seeing how far we can go and what influenced it and how all the variants of it. Sometimes you see this like standalone thing that you never see again. Other times you see, it's like rowan cross and red thread. You see it over and over, but there's variants. There's a whole body of lore around this, one article, one charm basically that has more information. So it can be tricky, but I think the witch trials, it's really interesting just to even think about, that time period and being in that position and like what we would do if that happened to us and how we would, like say anything and but also say stuff you knew. Kind of, I mean, it's just I've tried to do that a lot, and I mean, I guess that's the thing. I don't think we can take it at face value, that's for sure. And it is really controversial. So yeah, it's pretty uncomfortable, and it's really sad. I mean, I'm sure it's like I wonder if Isabel Gaudy knew like her confessions would be so famous, and there's a book written about it by Emma Wilby and all this stuff, and it's so incredible, and how it's influenced actually Wicca and traditional witchcraft. Her specific confessions, it's incredible. You realize, wow, this is like she probably had no idea. She was just trying to stay alive for another week. That was what she was doing. Yeah, maybe if I can make up some more stuff, I can stay alive, and it worked for quite a long time because she was an
Yeah.
incredible storyteller. So yeah, looking at the stories people knew, stories. That's in our, and folk magic that was being practiced before the trial. So when you find bits and pieces of information before the big hype, that's another thing is, but it's not like there's one source. So you have to dig around a lot, and then you see, oh, this thing was recorded as being done in 1200 or 1100 or whatever, around the turn of the century, 1,000 years ago, and you realize, okay, this was in folklore before the confession. So that's also another thing, is just tracing stuff back, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's really well said. I think that's a very balanced perspective. And yeah, I think keeping that front of mind, but also, you know, the lore is still fascinating regardless, even the fantastical aspects,
Yes,
like, to still be
absolutely.
able to take that in and be fascinated by it.
Right,
I think is
inspired.
still valuable. Inspired, there we go. Perfect. So your most recent book, which is it even officially out yet? The Devil's Ointment? Okay, cool.
Yes.
So I'm about halfway through it. I'm really loving it, and it's definitely the most in-depth witches flying ointment, magical ointment book I've ever encountered, which I love. I like that there's like a chapter specifically on human blood and human fat. um, so yeah, I just love it if you could give a bit of the background of what inspired you to write this book for people and what you're trying to do with it.
Yeah, I'm very excited this book is here. So yes, soft covers are shipping, hard covers will be shipping next week or at the end of next week. So the Devil's Ointment came about from, a lifelong love of toxic plants, which started when I was late teens. Probably from reading The Witch's Almanac and Elizabeth Pepper and this and that and some of those books. But basically, when I was in my early 20s, I did plant toxicology and I covered some of the witches' herbs specifically, but from a very scientific perspective. But I was fascinated by this idea that there was this salve that was made from poison plants that could cause flight. And at the time, I remember being like so overwhelmed, like what? But it was so cool to look at the toxicology of belladonna and henbane and poppy and some plants like monkshood. So I guess it started then in a way, like a seed was planted, and it was just kind of. It's always been this thing. I love that the witch's ointment, the devil's ointment, whatever you want to call it, it represents this like plant mystery that's just unequaled. It's so misunderstood. It's so intriguing, enigmatic, like just so like, whoa, like this idea that there's this greasy black or green, like toxic ointment that's like brewed in the witch's cauldron that, transforms a person and takes them into dreamland, into this like fantastical, like, but nightmarish place, is just so intriguing. And I think that it's been like, it's been like this thing where anytime I read anything about it, it's like cataloged in this way, like, oh, and has been for years. But I really felt like what I started seeing, just from, yeah, reading a lot of plant lore for a long time and growing toxic plants for a really long time and working with them, not internally, but in spiritual ways or magical ways, is that um, I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding surrounding the witch's ointment. And so that was really what motivated me to write the book. And I felt like it was another thing that I thought about for years and had collected some recipes and collected some related things and read everything I could about it for the last 5 years and or whatever beyond. Especially leading up to the writing of the book, which it was written, I started writing it almost 3 years ago and it's been written for 2.5 years. So I had to wait a little bit for it to come out. But I felt like I really wanted to do it justice, and I feel like that's what hasn't been done. There's some good stuff. There's some great research about it that's been out, but it always feels incomplete to me. I feel like there's parts of it that we need to look at more in depth, such as human blood and human fat. Those really need to be explored. That's like left out. People just skip to the toxic plants. We're missing all of the diabolical ointments that happened before toxic plants were even brought into it. And I feel like that's like the foundational stuff is the creepiest shit we can ever imagine. We have to cover that. So I really wanted to include that and not just do the, sexy toxic plant thing because it's so much more than that, and it's a mythological ointment. So I believe. And so, I think that but it came from all these streams. And I really think that in order to really understand it, we also need to look at how other magical ointments were used. So that was the other thing I wanted to do in the Devil's Ointment was bring other types of magical ointments from European folklore into the picture so we can even see how were people even thinking about ointments like working, like even in the first chapter, looking at really macabre mixtures just for purely medical reasons, like getting people to understand people were using blood, animal fat, bones in medical preparations, human materia medica, not just magic, so now we're so in our herbal communities, people make salves and it's so boring. People don't, I mean, compared to what it used to be, it's just like, oh, cool, plantain and lavender. It's just so boring compared to the past. When you look at, I love recipes and people in all my programs know this, the herb program, all the programs, I love recipes. And the Devil's Ointment is a book of recipes, but, of all sorts of recipes. But when you look at they're called receipts. Receipt is an old word for recipe. When you look at old receipt books from the 1600s and the 1500s or the late early 1600s from England, because they're written in English, so there's no language barrier, you see that the crazies, I have a bunch of these and I've collected these for many years, these types of books. There's crazy recipes for just medical use, let alone, like magical use. So I want to like take the reader through like an actual more historical context for what the witch's ointment really is. By the time we get to the end, which I call it the devil's ointment for a reason, of course, because it was given to the witch by the devil. Traditionally, the salve was or the recipe or making it at the Sabbath, right? But by the time we get to the end, you have some actual understanding of how folk magic, folk medicine, working with spirits, working with these transgressive aspects work, so we can actually understand it, and not just think about the toxic plants. That's just a small part of it, but it's the bridge. The toxic plants are the bridge between the witch's Sabbath and dreamland. So that's how they got introduced only from the physicians getting involved. And before that, the diabolical ointments contained no plants and no named plants at all. So we see that physicians understood that populian, it's basically just populian, it's a toxic plant ointment with poplar buds that was used for pain, sleep, and, just helping with those conditions, pain and sleep and dreams sometimes. But the idea was that, they were trying to explain how people got to the Sabbath. So of course they thought, well, they must be using populian because it's good for dreaming and sleeping. The sleep and dream part came in, the sleepy ointment came in through the physician's lens, and that added that layer. But it's been the only thing that's remained in modernity is that toxic plant connection that was brought in around 1550 and 1558 from Cardano and Porta. So it's really, that's just the tiniest part of the ointment history. So that's what I wanted to do. I felt frustrated that people focus on either just the toxic plants and whatnot, and or the poor organization and the material that is presented. It's so poorly organized. I wanted to do it justice and reorganize things, because people are throwing together lists and not recipes, from people like Johann Weyer. He makes a list of possible flying ointment ingredients, but it's not even a recipe. It's a list of simples that are used for sleep that are soporifics. This happened a lot where people are including populian recipes as a flying ointment. People are mixing up categories of how they're presenting things. And also, I think there's a big push to have the flying ointment be like some sort of lost entheogen of Europe. And I think that's total bullshit. There's no evidence that that was the case at all. And I have an argument for this in my book. And I like to say, let's remember the real entheogen of Europe, which is alcohol. Come on, folks. It was not a flying ointment. If you study plant toxicology, which I did, if you apply this stuff in any amount, large amount on open skin and large amounts, you would get sick as hell, and it wouldn't be good. Look into the type of poisoning that happens with these plants. Not to say they can, of course, they're helpful for pain and sleep, and maybe you have some good dreams, but it doesn't mean that that's how people were intending to use them beyond just their basic means for folk medicine. That's what I think. But there's a huge thing with power of suggestion. So if you suggest that an ointment was made from baby's fat dug up in the graveyard and blood from toads and pieces of the host, well, guess what? One person in the room is going to go try that, or two people in the room of 100 people are going to go try it. So there's no doubt that a body of lore was made, I think, from the power of suggestion. You can see records of people taking a populian toxic plant ointment and trying it in large amounts on people and saying they fell into a stupor and they had dreams about feasts and handsome men. Well, who wouldn't have dreams about feasts and handsome men? They're fucking starving and miserable, toiling. I mean, that tells us nothing. It just shows us people, I'm sure, overdosed on the ointment occasionally and would have some good dreams maybe, or whatever. We also didn't hear about all the terrible symptoms they had, like massive headache for days and dry mouth and, nausea and vertigo and whatever, happens with, poisoning from Solanaceae. So I think it's just silly to try to push for some sort of entheogenic kind of cult around the witch's ointment. It just doesn't do any of our ancestors justice and the lives that they lived, their hard lives. They were predisposed to trance. They didn't need an ointment to do trance. They didn't call it that, but they were predisposed to communication with spirits. They could go easily meet the devil without a damn ointment, without any entheogen at all. That's what we see happening. People were working with the devil without any ointment. So they could also, do acts of transgression without an ointment. I mean, that's where in Between the Witch and the Devil, we see them signing pacts with the devil, having spiritists and spirit familiars. They didn't need an ointment to do any of that. They were doing all of this stuff without an ointment. in folk medicine and folk magic just for those purposes. So I think, I don't know, I felt really called to at least lay it out in a logical way, make it easy to read, easy enough to read that you could actually feel consistency with the material and then get to the end and kind of have a better idea of it. I wanted to feel satisfied myself. So it was really fun to do that. And I just love that book so much. And it was a very hard book to write.
My favorite chapter so far is the chapter on human blood and the Strix and the Lamia. And there was a quote in there that I really enjoyed. In many respects, blood represented more than an ingredient in a magical potion, especially if it was human blood. It symbolized a larger concept. And I'm just curious if you could expand a bit on this larger concept that opens up maybe from a magical perspective for a practitioner.
Right. Well, blood is life force, right? Blood is the essence of life. And I mean, when you look at, that's why all those examples of how blood was used for medicine, just medicine, people lining up to get warm criminal blood to drink because they were epileptic. It's like stuff we would never do now. So blood represents this life force, this power, this fire, this electricity, this connection to ancestors. Nobody's saying that. That's what I think about it. Human blood is extremely magical. I mean, when we thinking about cannibalistic spirits who are seeking blood, I'm actually going to be doing a class this weekend about the Walking Dead and vampires, and for an overnight, there I'm throwing a small vampire component in there just for fun. But we're talking about the Walking Dead in Swedish folklore. But blood being this attractant for spirits, that's the thing I think about blood. It's an attractant. That's why I say we don't give blood as an offering lightly or freely. It's a really special offering. Same with red meat, but human blood or menstrual blood, that's not the thing to offer to everything because it's powerful. It attracts certain spirits. It has our essence. It's just, I mean, it's our own fire. So I think that that's why it's so charged, and it's so, it's like, whoa, this is like a very esoteric, weird ingredient. It's not just, I mean, if you're putting it in ointment, I mean, of course it's water and oil. I mean, you would have to probably do blood powder, which they sold in apothecaries sometimes. But yeah, it's more about those human ingredients bring in elements of the dead also. I mean, blood could be from a living person, but fat, no. We're dealing with elements of the dead, so that's something too. When we look at some of the ointments containing grave soil and human fat, and then, blood on top of that. And we don't know if that people were doing a ton of bloodletting historically. So it could have been just a byproduct from that. It doesn't, but criminal blood specifically from executions were used, magically and medicinally for so many reasons, because they were not only charged with the power of the dead because that criminal died, but the restless dead at that, right? A revenant, somebody who had more energy in their spirit. Their life got cut short, and cut short violently. So we all know that if we study any ghost lore, those are the problem. That's the category of spirits that gives the most problems to humans with disturbance. Restless dead, right? So I think that that's all why they were in there, along with the ill-omened animal blood or venom. You have these creatures associated with demons for a long time, way before the witch trials, because of some of those simple reasons I listed. I mean, just like destroying grain, destroying crops, animals associated with night workings and night flight and, nighttime secrets, and things like that. Animals associated with eating carrion, death. So they all had this, like, this reputation for thousands of years, really.
I want to move you into a little Patreon segment, but if you don't mind just giving your plugs now for all the listeners, how can they get in touch with you for in-person classes, online classes, and where's the best place to get updates and that sort of stuff from you?
Yeah. So my Instagram page is really the best, at Madam Raven's collection on Instagram. So if you just Google that or search that, you should be able to find it, or Google it actually. My website, it's maplemistwood.com, and it just directs you to the Instagram because the email on the website doesn't work. So Instagram message or Facebook message also. Either one of those are great ways just to reach me. And then I'm always updating stuff on both of those platforms just because it's easy to do. And that's where I'll put up information about online class openings or um, intensives or in person classes, any kind of. I've been doing some different lectures and book signing events recently. That kind of stuff all goes up there. So if folks are interested, I do have some online class openings pretty soon, in January, so just message me and I can get you on my list. So, yeah, and I also have um, the museum page, which, Museum of Victorian Superstitions and Spirits, so that's another Instagram page that's related, so that's just another little fun thing, but the main Instagram page is Madam Raven's collection, so that's really the best way to find out more.
Well, everybody, I can't recommend doing a class with Corinne enough. So everybody go out there and see what you can get involved in. In person would be ideal, but the online aspect is just as good. So yeah, well, not just as good. It's good.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's been a great year. I've found that we can do a lot online. We do transfer online, we do all sorts of stuff. So it is a really sweet group we have. So it's been rewarding. It's been the first full year of online that I've ever done. So I've been happy about that.
Awesome. Okay, Corinne, we're now in the Patreon segment. I thought it'd be kind of fun if you're okay talking about it, going a bit into the way you categorize different types of spirits. That was something I really, really enjoyed in this intensive because you kind of kick things off with this. And it's the kind of thing I really like hearing from practitioners or writers or teachers because even if I were to make my own list and it was different than yours, having you describe yours so clearly really helps me make my own mind up about my own perspective on these things. One thing you did that I really liked because a lot of this intensive was based around work with the dead, necromancy, that sort of thing, was you kind of broke down your view on different types of dead spirits in a way that I thought was really helpful. So, starting off, you designate a difference between beloved dead, ancestral dead, and kindred dead. So I'm curious if you could maybe describe some of the differences between those there, and maybe different ways we might approach them or work with them.
Yeah. So I feel like with spirits of the dead, it's so easy just to group them all into the same category. They were human dead, yeah. But there's really been a lot of nuance in my experience. I've worked with the dead a lot. It's something I've done for a long time in different ways and learned about a lot because I've been fascinated by it since I was a kid. And I feel like it's helpful to have some categories and some parameters around that so we can understand some of the nuances because actually in folklore, that's where I've really seen this show up, not in like, oh, there's a list somewhere because there's not, but more like, well, what does this look like versus that? And how do we kind of learn if we really want to do this work and work with spirits, we need to make some distinctions. And that's often what I say to students. We need to be making distinctions all the time and kind of clarifying and getting a little bit more specific instead of just so much generalizing. So beloved dead, I define that as, of course, people that have died that we loved, that we knew. It doesn't have to be a blood relative, but somebody, it could be a friend or our brother's best friend or, someone beloved dead. They were beloved to us, but we knew them. Ancestral dead, I define as a blood ancestor that we didn't know. So that means, your grandma's not your ancestor, she's your beloved dead. But your great great grandma that you never met, that's your ancestor, and then your great great grandpa. So for me, I know a lot of people define ancestors and they can say it could be blood or not blood, but I like to make a further distinction, and that's the kindred dead. So kindred dead being a non blood relative and also someone you didn't know but you have a connection to. So this can be, Georgia O'Keeffe or a dead practitioner that's been long dead that you visited the grave from. Um, that that is an important distinction because it's different than a blood relative. Sorry, Blackthorn's meowing.
Blackthorn has entered the chat.
Yeah, he's being psycho.